The morning began with a heavy stillness, the kind that makes even the air feel hesitant. People slowly filled the small municipal courtroom, most of them holding papers, tickets, or notices with anxious expressions. The old wooden benches creaked as they sat down, waiting for their names to be called. Some whispered to one another, while others stared straight ahead, hoping their time before the judge would pass quickly. At the front of the room stood the judge's bench, tall and polished, almost imposing. Behind it sat Judge Raymond Keller, a man known around town for being firm, strict, and rarely swayed by emotional stories. He believed rules were rules, and that excuses were simply excuses. Many people dreaded appearing before him. Today would be no different. The bailiff called for order, and the buzz of conversation faded. Judge Keller adjusted his glasses and began scanning the list of cases. His tone was clipped and direct as he moved through each one. A few people walked out with relief written across their faces, while others looked defeated after receiving fines or stern warnings. Then the bailiff called the next name. A quiet hush settled over the room as everyone watched a man slowly rise from the back row. He stood carefully, using a worn black cane for support. His steps were steady but strained, each movement showing the weight his body carried. His appearance was simple faded jeans, a clean but old jacket, and a tired expression that hinted at long nights and heavy thoughts. His name was Sam Donovan. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with a few strands of gray showing at his temples. His face was calm but weary, and his eyes held a kind of guarded sadness. As he made his way toward the front, the courtroom remained silent, the sound of his cane tapping on the floor echoing softly in the stillness. Judge Keller raised his eyes from the paperwork, briefly glancing at Sam as he approached. There was no warmth in the judge's gaze, only the stern professionalism he was known for. "Step forward," the judge instructed, his voice steady. Sam did as he was told, stopping just before the bench. He stood tall, despite the obvious discomfort in his leg. He held his ticket papers gently, as if they were much heavier than they looked. "State your name for the record," the judge said. "Sam Donovan," he answered, his voice low but clear. The judge looked down at the papers in front of him. "You are here regarding multiple unpaid parking violations and a failure to appear in court. Is that correct?" Sam nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Keller's brow tightened. "It seems you've ignored several notices. These violations didn't just appear overnight. You had more than enough time to address them." Sam swallowed softly. His fingers tightened slightly around the papers he held. "I understand, Your Honor. I wasn't trying to ignore anything." The judge leaned back a little, unimpressed. "That's not what your record shows." He tapped the stack of papers with a pen. "I have dates here showing repeated notices were sent. And yet here you stand, only after an order was issued. Why should this court believe you?" There was a quiet shifting of bodies among the benches as people sensed the tension building. Some watched with interest. Others looked away, uncomfortable with how sharp the judge's tone was. Sam took a slow breath. "Your Honor, I've been going through a lot. I've been in and out of treatment. I didn't mean to fall behind." Judge Keller cut him off quickly. "Treatment for what?" "Be specific." Sam hesitated. Not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he wasn't the kind of man who liked to speak about his personal struggles in front of strangers. But he had no choice. "For medical issues," he said quietly. "I've been dealing with injuries from my time in service." The judge didn't react. "That doesn't explain why you missed deadlines." Sam shifted his weight, wincing slightly from the pressure on his leg. "Your Honor, some of the appointment dates fell on the same days as the court notices. I thought I could handle both, but things got mixed up. His voice trailed off for a second. "I genuinely wasn't trying to avoid the court." But Judge Keller didn't soften. "Everyone has problems, Mr. Donovan, but the law applies to all of us. If people don't take responsibility for their obligations, then the entire system falls apart." Sam nodded slowly, his expression gentle but strained. "I understand that, sir. I really do. I take responsibility for the tickets. I just didn't have the chance to fix things sooner." The judge clicked his pen, clearly unimpressed with Sam's explanation. "Your violations are straightforward, Mr. Donovan. They don't require dramatic excuses. You parked illegally several times. Then, when given the chance to correct the issue, you didn't. Sam opened his mouth to respond, but the judge raised a hand. Let me finish. Sam stayed quiet. Now you're standing here asking this court to believe that you had no opportunity to address these matters? The judge said, his voice growing more pointed. Sam's fingers trembled slightly as he took a breath. Your Honor, I'm not saying I had no opportunity. I'm just saying things were difficult for me. I'm still adjusting. Some days are harder than others, and everyone has hard days, Judge Keller replied sharply. That doesn't make them exempt from the law. A few people in the courtroom looked down, uncomfortable. The tone felt too harsh, even for a courtroom. But no one dared say anything. Sam lowered his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. When he looked up again, there was no anger in his expression, only a quiet kind of sadness. Your Honor, I'm not trying to get out of anything. I'm only trying to explain why things happened the way they did. Judge Keller let out a small sigh, leaning forward. Mr. Donovan, excuses do not help you. Facts do. The fact remains that you failed to pay your tickets and failed to appear in court. That is not a small matter. Sam nodded again, more out of politeness than agreement. He could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier by the minute. The judge picked up the papers again. You owe fines for 3 separate violations, plus a penalty for missing your court date. Based on your record, I see no reason to reduce or dismiss any of these charges. The words hit Sam harder than he expected. For a moment, his shoulders dipped. He had hoped just a little that the judge might listen, might understand. But it was clear that the judge saw him as just another case on a long list. Sam opened his mouth once more, desperation gently rising in his voice. Your Honor, if I could just explain, Judge Keller cut him off again. Mr. Donovan, I've heard enough. Sam fell silent. His eyes drifted briefly toward the benches where a few people watched with sympathy. Others stared blankly, perhaps thinking about their own cases. None of them knew what he was going through. No one here truly understood the depth of his struggles. But Sam didn't blame them. He rarely explained his situation, even to those close to him. Today was the first time he had spoken so openly, and even now he wasn't sure he had said enough. The judge straightened his papers, preparing to finalize the decision. The court will issue the full fines, but before he could finish his sentence, Sam shifted his foot slightly to adjust his balance. His leg, weakened from old injuries, trembled as he tried to steady himself. He tightened his grip on the cane. It rattled softly. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Sam looked down briefly, trying to regain his stability without making a scene. He didn't want pity. He didn't want attention. All he wanted was to be understood for just a moment. But Judge Keller did not pause. His tone remained cold, his expression unreadable. And failure to comply may result in further action by the court, continued. Sam felt a small knot forming in his chest. Not anger, just the familiar disappointment he had felt many times since returning home, the kind that reminded him he was still struggling to rebuild a life that once felt steady. The judge looked at him again. But this time, there was something sharper in his eyes, impatience. Do you have anything else you wish to say before the court finalizes this? Sam wanted to speak. He wanted to explain how his injuries affected his days, how his treatments often left him exhausted, how he sometimes forgot simple tasks because his mind was still healing. He wanted to tell the judge that he wasn't careless, just overwhelmed. He wanted to speak from the heart, but the look on the judge's face told him none of it would matter. So Sam took a slow breath and said only, "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded sharply. Very well. As he began writing the final notes for the ruling, the courtroom remained painfully quiet. People watched Sam with a mixture of sadness and uncertainty. Some seemed to think the judge was being too harsh. Others simply felt sorry for the man standing alone before the bench. Sam stayed still, holding his papers with tired hands, waiting for the judge to finish. His leg hurt. His back ached, and his heart felt heavier than when he had first walked in. But he kept standing, kept breathing, kept trying, because that was what he always did. At that moment, no one in the room knew that everything was about to change. No one knew that a single, unexpected moment would shift the entire atmosphere of the courtroom and reveal something deeper about the man standing before them. But for now, all they saw was a strict judge, a tired veteran, and a verdict that seemed already decided. The courtroom stayed quiet after the judge finished speaking, but the air felt heavier than before. Sam stood there, trying to keep his balance while holding the papers in his hand. His fingers trembled a little, not from fear, but from the stress of everything piling on him at once. He wished the situation were different. He wished he could explain things in a way that made sense. But whenever he tried, the words seemed too small for the truth. Judge Keller didn't look up right away. He was still writing notes, his pen moving quickly across the page. Every stroke felt like another wall being built between him and Sam. People in the seats behind Sam whispered quietly, some sympathizing with him, others simply anxious for their own turn. It was one of those moments when time felt stretched, like the room was holding on to something unseen. "Mr. Donovan," the judge said finally, looking up with a firm expression, "these violations are serious. Ignoring them only makes things worse. The court cannot accept excuses in place of responsibility." Tap the papers in front of him. "And based on your record, it seems responsibility has been lacking." Sam's jaw tightened a little, though he kept his expression calm. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to cause trouble. But it was hard standing there knowing he was being misunderstood. He simply said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor." The apology seemed to fall flat. The judge looked at him for a moment, almost as if trying to read him, but instead of understanding, the look only grew firmer.
Sorry isn't enough when the law is broken,"
the judge replied. "Your injuries, while unfortunate, do not cancel out legal obligations. And they do not explain why you missed your court date without contact." Sam opened his mouth slightly, but the judge raised his hand, signaling he wasn't finished. "People often try to use personal hardship as an excuse," the judge continued. His voice wasn't cruel, but it carried a sharp edge. "You're not the first person to stand here with a sad story. The law exists for a reason. If exceptions were made every time someone claimed difficult circumstances, we would have no structure at all." Sam's shoulders tensed. He lowered his eyes again. He didn't think his situation was a sad story. It was simply his life. A life he was still trying to adjust to after everything he had been through. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Explain to the court," he said, "why you ignored so many notices. And please, give a clear answer this time." The tone stung a bit. Not because of the words, but because of the doubt behind them. Sam took a slow breath. He knew the judge thought he was making excuses, but he also knew he had no other choice but to speak honestly. "Your Honor," Sam said softly, "I didn't ignore the notices. I missed some because my treatments take time, and some days I'm too tired to think straight when I get home. I had appointments at the hospital, and a few of them were changed last minute. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I wasn't trying to hide. I just got overwhelmed." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Overwhelmed with what exactly?" Sam hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because speaking about personal pain out loud always felt uncomfortable. He wasn't someone who liked sharing private details, especially not in a room full of strangers, but he owed himself at least that honesty. With everything, he said finally, "My injuries, the pain, the appointments, trying to keep up. Trying to work when I can. Some days I can't even sleep right. It all just gets heavy." He paused, then added, "I'm not trying to be irresponsible. I just needed more time." The judge listened, but his expression didn't soften. "Mr. Donovan, your situation sounds difficult, but many people in this courtroom struggle with personal issues every day. They still manage to meet deadlines. Why should the court show leniency to you when others do not receive the same treatment?" Sam didn't answer right away. He didn't want special treatment. He didn't even want the charges dismissed. He only wanted the judge to understand that he wasn't careless or disrespectful. "I'm not asking for leniency," Sam said quietly. "I'm asking for understanding." The room was silent for a moment. Even the judge paused. But instead of understanding, his reply came back stern. "The law cannot operate on understanding alone," he said. "It must operate on consistency." Sam felt something inside him sink. No matter what he said, The judge had already made up his mind. It wasn't personal. It wasn't about him. It was about the judge's rules he followed strictly. Judge Keller flipped another page in the file. I also see here that you failed to respond to the final notice sent 2 months ago. Why was that ignored? Sam took a breath. That notice had arrived during a particularly difficult week. He had been in physical therapy, dealing with pain that spread through his back and leg, making even simple tasks exhausting. He had set the notice on his table, meaning to come back to it, but instead it got lost under other papers. By the time he remembered, the date had already passed, but explaining that felt pointless. I made a mistake, Sam said. I forgot. I should have handled it better. I'm sorry. The judge didn't blink. Mistakes have consequences, Mr. Donovan. The kind that came from feeling unseen. Something in the judge's eyes showed impatience. You are a grown man. You are responsible for your actions. This court cannot accept forgetting as a justification for ignoring legal notices. The words hit harder than the judge probably intended. Sam wasn't used to being spoken to like that. He had spent years serving others, putting their needs before his own. Now here he was, being talked to like someone who didn't care at all. The judge reached for another paper. Is there anything else you would like to say before I finalize the ruling? Sam lifted his eyes slowly. For a second, there was something raw and honest in them. Not pride, not anger, but the deep exhaustion of someone who had been trying for a long time and felt like he was failing despite his best efforts. Your Honor, he said softly, I've been doing everything I can. It might not look like it. It might not be enough for the court, but I'm trying. I'm really trying. The judge exhaled sharply, almost irritated by what he saw as another emotional attempt. Trying is not the same as doing the required tasks, he said. The court cannot grant exceptions based on effort alone. Sam's shoulders lowered again. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. Some people frowned, not at him, but at the harshness of the exchange. Others watched quietly, unsure how to feel about the situation. A woman in the back row whispered to the person next to her, He seems like he really is struggling. But the whisper was too soft for the judge to hear. The judge continued writing, not making eye contact. These violations will need to be paid in full, he said. The penalties apply as written. There will be no adjustment. Sam's breath hitched slightly, but he kept his composure. He wasn't someone who made scenes. He had learned to stay calm, even when things hurt. His leg ached more now, and he shifted slightly to ease the pressure. The cane felt heavier in his hand than it had earlier. The judge didn't notice, or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. You will receive instructions for payment, the judge said. Failure to comply will result in further consequences. Sam nodded. Yes, Your Honor. His voice was steady, but inside he felt something break a little. Not a dramatic break, just a quiet one. The kind that comes when you expect nothing but still hope for a small bit of understanding, only to receive none. Judge Keller set the file aside, signaling the end of the case. You may step back, he said. Sam nodded again. He turned slowly, careful not to lose balance. His leg tightened painfully, but he hid the wince behind a calm expression. He took a step, then another, the tapping sound of his cane echoing through the quiet room as he walked toward the benches. His foot caught the edge of a small, uneven spot on the floor. His body lurched slightly forward, and he grabbed the cane with both hands to steady himself. A few people gasped softly. The bailiff took a step forward, but stopped when he saw Sam regain control. Sam breathed out slowly, grateful he didn't fall. But he felt embarrassed. He hated drawing attention to himself. He continued walking until he reached the aisle, then carefully lowered himself onto the bench. People around him pretended not to stare, but he could feel their eyes. Some were sympathetic, others curious. Sam stared straight ahead, trying to calm his breathing. His leg pulsed with pain. The judge had already moved on to the next case, his voice echoing through the room once more. The courtroom buzz returned, but Sam didn't hear it clearly. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere tired. As he sat there, holding the papers that felt like another weight added to his life, He wondered how everything had become this difficult. Not long ago, things felt clearer. He had purpose. He had direction. Now everything felt like a series of obstacles he had to climb with one leg and one tired heart. Still, even with the pain, even with the disappointment, he didn't give up. He never did. He simply sat there, breathing slowly, waiting for the next step, whatever it would be. What he didn't know was that this difficult moment, this heavy silence, was only the beginning. Something unexpected was coming. Something that would shift the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Something that would open a door he didn't know existed. But for now, all he could do was sit quietly. Unaware of how close everything was to changing, the courtroom noise faded into a soft blur around Sam as he sat on the wooden bench, trying to steady his breath. He didn't want anyone to see how drained he felt. He kept his eyes lowered, fixed on the papers in his hands, though he wasn't really reading them. His thoughts drifted in different directions toward the fines he now owed, the treatments he still needed, and the heavy feeling in his chest that wasn't from pain alone. The judge continued calling cases, his voice echoing through the room, but Sam barely heard him. The earlier exchange kept replaying in his mind. He wondered if he should have explained things differently, or if he should have spoken louder or more directly. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't have made much difference. The judge had walked into that courtroom, already prepared to be strict. Sam was just another name on a long list. Still, the disappointment stung. Not because of the fines, but because of how small he felt, how invisible his struggle seemed. He took a quiet breath and leaned his cane against the bench. His leg throbbed with a dull ache that had become part of his daily life. He rubbed the side of his knee gently, trying to ease the tension. A few people near him stole glances there, expressions mixed with sympathy and curiosity, but Sam kept his eyes forward. He wanted the hearing to end, wanted to leave the courtroom and step outside where the air was lighter, where no one was watching him. But before he could get that far, something unexpected began to unfold. The courtroom had settled back into its routine. A young man approached the bench for his case. The judge questioned him, flipping through paperwork as he spoke. People whispered softly among themselves again. Pressure in the room seemed to return to normal. Then Sam shifted slightly, easing the weight on his injured leg. He tried to sit up straighter, feeling a sudden pinch run down his thigh. Instinctively, he reached for his cane, but his fingers grazed only the edge of it. The cane slipped from its place and knocked onto the floor with a sudden, sharp clatter. The sound was louder than he expected, louder than anyone in the room expected. The noise bounced off the walls and cut through the quiet conversations, and then Sam's balance gave out. He reached forward quickly, trying to catch himself on the bench, but his leg buckled. His body tilted forward, and the papers in his hand fluttered. It wasn't falling fast. But the movement was unsteady and clear enough that a few people gasped. Before he hit the floor, a hand caught his arm, then another. 2 men had risen at the same time, one from the far left bench, another from the row behind Sam. Both moved quickly, steadying him with gentle but firm hands. "Easy," one of them said softly. "We've got you." Sam blinked in surprise. He looked up at the 2 strangers helping him. They weren't dressed alike, but both wore small clues of who they were. One had a faded military unit jacket, worn from age. The other wore a simple cap with an emblem stitched on the front. An emblem Sam instantly recognized veterans as fellow veterans of the courtroom, which had been full of soft whispers moments earlier, fell silent. Every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward the small scene unfolding in the middle rows. Sam steadied himself as the men helped him sit back down. His heart pounded not from embarrassment this time, but from the sudden rush of support. He hadn't expected anyone to move, let alone to men he had never spoken to. "Thank you," Sam whispered, slightly breathless. The man with the cap nodded. "Don't mention it." Before Sam could fully gather himself, the judge's voice cut through the room. "Is everything all right over there?" He asked, irritation and confusion mixed in his tone. The man in the military jacket straightened his posture and turned toward the judge. "He's all right now, Your Honor. He just lost his balance." Judge Keller squinted from his bench. This is a courtroom, not a gathering place. Please keep order." The man didn't back down. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a calm firmness. "With respect, Your Honor, sometimes people need help. He served with us, and we're not going to sit back and watch him struggle." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom again. The tension shifted, not sharp like before, but charged. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Someone had spoken in Sam's defense. Someone had acknowledged what the judge hadn't, for the first time since Sam entered the room. The judge actually looked at him. Really looked. His eyes moved from Sam's tired face to the cane on the floor, then to the men standing beside him. The judge's expression softened not fully, but enough that the change was noticeable. "Sit down. Both of you," the judge said to the veterans, but his tone was less stern. "I appreciate the concern. Let's maintain order so we can continue." The men nodded respectfully and returned to their seats, though they kept their eyes on Sam to make sure he was steady. Sam shifted slightly, picking up his cane with slow movements. He could still feel the heat of everyone's gaze, but this time it didn't feel judgmental. It felt different, almost supportive. Judge Keller cleared his throat, tried to return to the case in front of him, but something in his posture had changed. He tapped his pen lightly on the bench, then looked again toward Sam. "Double quotes, Mr. Donovan," said his voice noticeably calmer. "Are you able to continue sitting there safely, or do you need assistance?" The question seemed simple, but it was. The first time the judge had spoken to Sam with anything close to concern. Sam felt a small lump form in his throat. He nodded slowly. "I'm fine, Your Honor, thank you," the judge nodded back, but his gaze lingered for a moment more, as if he were seeing Sam differently now. The courtroom settled again, but the mood had changed entirely. A quiet awareness spread across the room, something human, something grounded. The judge paused between cases more often, glancing occasionally in Sam's direction, not to judge, but to observe. Sam, meanwhile, sat quietly, still recovering from the moment. His heart was beating slower now, but the emotions in him were swirling. He felt embarrassment for stumbling, gratitude for the helping hands, and a strange warmth he hadn't felt in a while. It was the feeling of being seen, really seen by others who understood without needing an explanation. The man in the cap leaned forward slightly and whispered just loud enough for Sam to hear, "We've all been there. You're not alone." Sam swallowed gently, the words hitting deeper than expected. He didn't know these men. He didn't know their stories, their struggles, or what brought them to court today. But they understood him in a way others didn't. They recognized the way he moved, the way he braced himself before standing, the way his eyes held quiet weight. They knew because they carried their own quiet weights too, as the judge continued. With the next case, something noticeable happened in the courtroom. People who had been absorbed in their own worries now watched the scene with softer eyes. A woman who had been fidgeting earlier now sat calmly, her hands folded gently in her lap. A man near the aisle nodded slightly toward Sam, as if offering silent encouragement. It wasn't sympathy. It was respect. Minutes passed, but the energy in the room didn't return to what it had been before. The judge seemed more thoughtful, more cautious with his tone. It was as if the small moment of support had shifted not only the courtroom's mood, but also the judge's sense of responsibility. Finally, after finishing the last of the current cases, Judge Keller set his pen down and looked at Sam again. "Mr. Donovan," he said, "please step forward again." Sam looked up slowly, surprised. He hadn't expected to be called back. His body tensed slightly, unsure of what this meant. The two veterans looked at him as if ready to help, but Sam shook his head gently, signaling he was all right. He pushed himself up carefully, using the cane for support. His leg trembled slightly, but he steadied himself. The walk to the front felt different this time, not because the pain was gone, but because he didn't feel alone anymore. People watched him, but their eyes carried empathy. It's not judgment. When he reached the bench, the judge studied him quietly for a moment. "You may rest your weight if needed," the judge said softly. Sam nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." A small shift, a small crack in the judge's hard exterior. "Mr. Donovan," the judge began, "what happened moments ago, it was concerning. It also brought something to my attention that perhaps I did not consider thoroughly before. Sam listened quietly, unsure where the judge was going with this. "I have seen many people come through this courtroom," the judge continued. "Some with excuses, some with genuinely difficult circumstances. I may have been too quick to treat your case as the former." Sam's heart beat a little faster. The judge glanced toward the two veterans who had helped Sam. "It is clear that you are dealing with challenges that go beyond what is written in this file." A long pause hung between them. Sam stood still, cane in hand, waiting. The judge cleared his throat again, softer this time. "I would like to hear more from you, Mr. Donovan, if you're willing." The room stayed silent, completely still. For the first time since the hearing began, Sam felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. He took a breath, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I can explain." And for the first time, the judge listened not as a strict voice of law, but as a person. Something powerful had begun. Something that would reshape not only the case, but the judge's entire view of what justice meant. But Sam didn't know that yet. The moment had only just opened. The real change was still unfolding, just beneath the surface, ready to rise. The judge sat there, staring at the papers in front of him. But for once, he didn't read a single word written on them. His eyes were still on the man standing in the middle of the courtroom, the same man he had been so quick to judge only minutes earlier. Something had shifted inside him when he saw those two veterans step forward. It was like the entire courtroom had taken a breath at the same time, waiting to see what he would do next. Even he wasn't sure what direction things were going to take. But he felt something in his chest, a heaviness. Yes, but also an urge to understand. He cleared his throat softly and looked at the man again. He wasn't someone who liked repeating himself, but he suddenly felt the need to start over. He leaned forward slightly and spoke in a quieter tone than before, the kind of voice he rarely used while sitting on that bench. "Sir," he said, "would you tell me a little more about your service?" The man didn't seem to expect that question. His shoulders lifted a little, like he was unsure if he should say anything at all. But then he nodded and took a slow breath. The courtroom was silent, as if everyone had been placed on pause. Even the bailiff, who normally looked bored out of his mind, seemed to be paying attention now. The man explained that he had served overseas for several years. He didn't raise his voice or try to make his story dramatic. He just talked in a steady, plain tone. The kind of voice someone uses when they're sharing something personal. Something they've repeated many times to doctors or counselors, but still feel deep down. He talked about the injuries he had returned with, injuries that made everyday life slow and painful. He talked about the long waits at the hospital, the paperwork he didn't always understand, in the days when he could barely get out of bed. What struck the judge most wasn't the details. It was the way the man spoke, calm, humble, almost apologizing for the trouble he caused, even though nothing he described sounded like his fault. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't complain. He just explained. The judge felt something stir inside him, a memory he hadn't expected to surface. He thought of his father and how, for years, he had watched that strong, proud man slowly weaken as old injuries and time caught up to him. He remembered helping him walk across the living room, same way one of those veterans helped the man in court moments earlier. He had always respected his father, but he had never truly understood the quiet weight he carried. Now, looking at this man struggling to stand without showing he was in pain, that old understanding flooded back like a sudden wave. He felt his jaw tighten, and he sat back slowly. For once he didn't hide the emotion on his face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even frustrated. He was simply touched in a way he didn't expect. "Why didn't you say any of this earlier?" the judge asked, his tone softer than before. The man glanced down, almost embarrassed. "I didn't want to make excuses. I know everyone has problems. I didn't think mine mattered more than anyone else's." Those words hit the judge harder than anything else said that morning. For a long moment, he didn't respond. He simply looked at the man, really seeing him now, not just as a case number or a name on a printout. He saw him as a human being. One of the veterans from the bench cleared his throat lightly. "Your Honor," he said gently, "he's not the kind of man to ask for special treatment. If anything, he's the kind who always feels like he has to handle things alone. The judge nodded. Understanding that type far too well, he looked down at the file in front of him again. But this time, he didn't see violations and fines. He saw late appointments, pain-filled mornings, long hospital visits, confusion, and exhaustion. It was different when you saw the person behind the paper. He took a deep breath and rubbed the bridge of his nose. It wasn't often he felt the need to slow down and choose his words carefully, but today called for it. He spoke deliberately, making sure his tone carried sincerity rather than authority. "I want to make sure I understand everything," he said. "Can you tell me about the medical appointments you mentioned earlier? The ones that caused you to miss your court dates?" The man explained again, this time with more detail. He talked about physical therapy sessions that lasted longer than expected, appointments that were pushed back by hours, long lines that never seemed to move. He explained that he didn't drive on some days because the pain medication made him too drowsy to be safe on the road. He talked about calling the court office once or twice, but not knowing the right terms to use or which extension to dial as he talked. The judge could hear the quiet honesty in every word. There were no signs of lies or exaggeration, just a man overwhelmed by everything happening in his life. When he finished, the judge didn't respond right away. He looked around the courtroom and noticed that even the people waiting for their own cases seemed moved by the story. Some sat with softened expressions. Others looked thoughtful. Finally, the judge leaned forward and clasped his hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised even him. "I appreciate you telling me all of this." The man nodded slightly, unsure what to expect. The judge continued, "I want you to know something. Sometimes this courtroom can feel like a place where people are only judged by their mistakes. But you're more than a set of missed dates and unpaid tickets. You're a person who has been through a lot, and your service matters. Your struggles matter, and your honesty matters too." The man's eyes lowered again, but this time, it wasn't out of shame. It was emotion, something he didn't always show. The judge let out a quiet breath, as though he was releasing all the stiffness he usually kept locked inside. "I may have been too quick earlier. I didn't take the time to understand you. That's on me." No one in the courtroom expected to hear words like that from him, not the attorneys, not the clerk, not the people waiting for their cases. Even the man seemed surprised, as if he didn't know how to react. Then the judge turned to the two veterans who had stood earlier. "Thank you," he said. "Both of you. Your support made a difference today." They nodded respectfully, one placing a hand lightly on the back of the bench, as if steadying himself from the emotion in the room. The judge took another breath and turned back to the man. He studied him, trying to decide the best way to help. He wasn't someone who liked bending rules, but he also wasn't someone who ignored what was right in front of him. There were guidelines for what he could do, but guidelines always left room for judgment. And today, his judgment was guided more by compassion than procedure. He asked the man one more question. Gently, "What kind of support do you have outside of these appointments? Do you have someone helping you? Family? Friends?" The man shook his head. "Not really. I try not to bother anyone." "What?" The judge nodded slowly, taking that in. He understood the type: strong, quiet, always trying to carry the load alone. Someone who didn't ask for help even when he desperately needed it. He leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. Then he spoke in a firm but kind tone. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone," he said. "And you won't." The man lifted his eyes. Unsure what that meant, the judge continued. "There are programs we work with groups that help veterans with paperwork, with rides, with appointments, with understanding court notices. They're good people. They don't judge. They help." The man listened quietly, his expression softening. "I'm going to connect you with them," the judge said. "They'll make sure you don't fall behind again, and they'll support you in ways you won't have to feel guilty about." For the first time since he entered the room, the man's shoulders relaxed. Not much, but enough for the judge to notice. The judge sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. Everyone seemed to feel the shift, the new atmosphere gentler, more understanding, more human. The judge spoke again, more softly now. "I want to thank you for your service. Truly." The man nodded, and for a second it looked like he might say something. But no words came, only a quiet breath. The judge knew there was still a decision to make. The charges, the fines, the paperwork, they all still existed. But the way he viewed them had changed entirely. And with that change, a new kind of verdict was forming in his mind. He looked at the man once more, his voice steady but kind. "Let me take care of the rest." And for the first time all morning, hope flickered in the man's eyes. The courtroom felt calmer now, almost like the heavy air from earlier had finally lifted. The judge sat quietly for a moment, his eyes on the man before him. He could sense the room waiting, every person watching, wondering what he would decide. But for the first time in a long while, the judge wasn't thinking about rules or penalties. He was thinking about the person standing in front of him, the weight he carried, and the courage it took for him to open up. The judge took a slow breath and folded his hands neatly. His tone was gentle but solid, the kind of voice he used when he was absolutely sure of what he needed to say. "I've reviewed everything," he began, "and based on the circumstances, I'm choosing to dismiss the charges." The room went still. No one moved. No one whispered. It was as if the entire courtroom froze in place so the words could settle properly into the air. The man blinked slowly, almost confused by what he had heard. He shifted his weight on his cane, not out of pain this time, but because he didn't know how to react. It was rare for him to receive good news. It's an even rarer for someone in authority to speak to him with such kindness. The judge continued, "Your fines will be canceled. Your missed court dates won't be held against you. And going forward, you'll receive help from a group that works with us. They'll make sure you're supported. You won't have to handle everything alone anymore." For a moment, the man didn't say anything. He simply swallowed, his eyes lowering as the words sank in. His shoulders trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from relief. One of the veterans in the back row placed a hand on the other's shoulder, both of them sharing a look that said they had seen moments like this before, but they never stopped feeling them. The judge saw the man's quiet reaction and softened even more. He wasn't used to moments like this. His courtroom was normally a place of stern warnings and predictable rulings, but today felt different. Today, he had made a decision not based on punishment, but on understanding. "Do you have any questions?" the judge asked gently. The man shook his head. "No, sir. His voice cracked a little, and he looked down again. "Thank you." It wasn't a loud thank you. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was soft, almost whispered. But that soft voice carried more weight than anything else spoken that morning. The judge nodded once, slowly. He didn't smile, but his face relaxed in a way that showed his respect. "You're welcome. And remember, you deserve the support you're being given. There's no shame in that." The man lifted his eyes for a brief second, just long enough to acknowledge the judge with a quiet nod, as the judge gathered some papers. The clerk prepared to call the next case. People began to shift in their seats, but something unusual happened. Instead of focusing on their own problems, many of them were watching the man as he prepared to leave. Some gave him small nods of encouragement. Others simply looked at him with a new understanding when he tore. Ned to walk out, the two veterans who had stood earlier immediately moved toward him. One stepped to his side and offered a steady arm. The man didn't argue this time. He accepted the help, leaning on his cane with one hand and the veteran's arm with the other. The judge watched him walk toward the door and, without thinking, he stood up. It shocked the courtroom. Judges almost never stood when someone left. But today wasn't like any other day. Today wasn't about rules. It was about respect. The man looked back just before stepping out. When he saw the judge standing, he froze for a second. The judge didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply gave a firm, respectful nod. A small gesture, but one that carried deep meaning. The man nodded back. And for a moment, both men held each other's gaze, one full of quiet dignity, the other full of gratitude. Then the man left the courtroom with the veterans at his side as the door closed behind them. The room felt different. Something unspoken lingered in the air, a reminder that compassion still had a place, even in the most rigid of environments. The judge sat back down, but he didn't immediately call the next case. He took a moment to gather himself, the weight of what happened still settling in his chest. He wasn't ashamed of the emotion he felt. If anything, he felt more human than he had in a long time. The clerk leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice so others wouldn't hear. "That was really something, Your Honor?" The judge didn't look at her at first. He took a quiet breath, letting the last of the tension fade from his shoulders. "Some decisions," he said, "are about more than paperwork." He finally glanced at her and saw her nod in agreement. He looked out at the remaining people in the courtroom. Some seemed inspired, some thoughtful. But every single one of them had witnessed something rare that morning, something that reminded them that there was a person behind the bench. And that fairness didn't always mean strictness. The next case was called, but even as the judge listened, part of him was still thinking about the man who had walked out moments earlier. He wondered if he would find the support he needed. He hoped so. And he hoped that, in some small way, today had helped him move forward. Later that afternoon, after court had ended and most of the staff had gone home, the judge sat alone at his desk. The courthouse was quiet now, the distant echo of footsteps the only sound in the long hallways. He leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together. He thought again about the moment when the two veterans stood to help their friend. He remembered the look on the man's face when the charges were dismissed. He remembered the soft thank you. He hadn't realized just how deeply the moment had affected him until now. After a long pause, he opened a drawer and pulled out a small, worn photograph of his father. A younger version of himself stood beside him in the photo, smiling awkwardly. His father had a proud yet tired expression, the kind that spoke 1,000 unspoken stories. The judge stared at the picture. For a long time, you would have understood. Today he murmured softly to himself. He placed the photo back carefully and closed the drawer. Before he left the building, he made one more decision. He contacted the veteran support group he had mentioned in court earlier and asked them to send him updates on the man's progress, not to meddle. But to make sure he didn't slip through the cracks again, he didn't tell anyone about this choice. He didn't make it part of the official record. He simply cared, and that was enough. In the days that followed, word of what happened spread quietly through the courthouse. Staff members spoke about it in break rooms. Attorneys mentioned it in passing. Even people who hadn't been in the courtroom heard the story and felt moved by it. Some said the judge had changed. Others said he had simply shown a side of himself no one expected. But one thing was certain. That moment had left a mark not just on the man who walked out with hope, but on the judge who finally saw the human behind the case. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.